Good afternoon, everyone. I think that's all the BRICS languages, distinguished delegates from BRICS countries, social partners, international institutions. Let me just say, all protocols observed. So my name is Jens Dyring Christensen. As you can see up there on the screen, I'm the Senior Specialist for Sustainable Enterprises. I'm based in South Africa. And with me, I have Mr. Nimoy Thompson, who's a former advisor to the President of Ghana. And we are now so lucky that he has joined us here at the ILO to lead our productivity ecosystem project in South Africa. So before Nimoy comes on, I just want to unpack productivity a bit more, because productivity has been spoken about a lot. But what do we actually mean by productivity? And I think we all just need to get on the same page. So allow me to spend a few minutes on what is productivity, how does it link to decent work. As Claire, my colleague, said, productivity, simply put, measures the amount of value created for each hour that is worked in a society. And that doesn't matter if it's only labor productivity, but also capital productivity, multi-factor productivity, total productivity, as Mr. Motiba spoke about. And you all know the amount of work you can get done in one day is your rate of productivity, right? We all know about that. But for companies and for countries, measuring productivity is, of course, a lot more complex. So on a country scale, productivity can mean the difference between good and not so good standards of living. We've heard that. And I'm sure that many of us are familiar with the famous words of Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008, when he said, productivity isn't everything. But in the long run, it is almost everything, because a country's ability to improve its standards of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. And I think that is very, very true, and we buy into that at the ILO. And for an enterprise, if we look at the micro level, for an enterprise, its productivity rate determines if it can afford to increase wages for its employees, whether it can offer job quality, or even continue to operating and stay in business, right? So in short, if productivity is stagnating or contracting, it is not good for companies, and it is not good for countries, and ultimately not for workers in an enterprise. And in fact, we see, and we've heard this today, that countries with low productivity also have higher decent work deficits. So let me just go back to history, because when the ILO was formed in 1919, we have devoted many efforts to understanding the relationship between productivity and labor, between wages and productivity, and the relationship between productivity and decent work. And I just want to tell you, and you might be interested in knowing, that the very first ILO Convention number 1 from 1919, the very first international labor standard, was actually called Hours of Work in Industry. And this Convention number 1, is actually at the heart of the debate more than 100 years later, since it was the first one that regulated the hours of working time. So what we saw throughout the industrial development in the late 1800s, it was recognized that working excessive hours posed a danger to workers' health and to their families. But at the time, opponents to the convention at the time, they argued that regulating working hours would negatively affect productivity, whereas proponents argued that it would increase productivity. So this very first ILO convention provided for adequate rest period for workers. And today, I think we all agree, it is conventional wisdom that productivity and good working conditions are linked. If we don't have our coffee breaks here, if we don't have our lunch breaks, if we don't, like Nimoy, have a nap in his room from time to time, we are not productive. And I think that's very important. Now, just talking about trade unions, one thing that especially workers and trade unions get concerned about is when productivity programs are introduced without their involvement. They feel it's at the expense of workers, that it is about introducing new labor cost saving technology and automation, which ultimately will lead to laying off workers. And I think this is where the ILO approach to including the productivity ecosystem for decent work is different, because for the ILO, the fundamental principle is that the workers, the hard-working men and women, is the most important asset of any business. As we heard from Justice, a business is not built by brick and mortar, but by its people. It's not the machines, it's not the business premises. In other words, and I think if we all prescribe to ILO values, it is the value of labor, such as the hours of work that hard-working men and women put into the goods and products and services that we all buy. I think that is key to our discussion about productivity. Work and labor productivity is the source of value, and I think that's very important, and we must not lose sight of this. But we must also be realistic, and here I come to my, so here we spoke about labor productivity. Then we must be realistic, I think, and acknowledge that free enterprise and the legitimate quest for profit, capital investment, is central to the productivity equation. It's not just about workers, it's not just about labor rights. Legitimate quest for profit, I think that's very important, and we have to acknowledge that also just to console our employers. Because in addition to labor productivity, capital productivity is important. I've put it up there on the screen. It's an important as a measure of how well physical capital, such as real estate, equipment, inventory, land use, are actually productively used to generate goods and services that we buy, right? And then these things seen together, your high levels of labor productivity and capital productivity is an important indicator of a country's overall standard of living. I mean, just look at the international statistics. And then there's this strange animal that I think Mr. Motiba also spoke about. He called it total factor productivity. We can also call it multi-factor productivity. These are, we also call them intangibles. Those are the things that we can't really put a figure on. We can't, it's not labor productivity, it's not capital productivity, but it's innovation. It's product-led innovation, it's good management, it's all those, it's quality of leadership. And one of my famous economists, favorite economist, Joseph Schumpeter, he actually said back in 1934, in his famous book, The Theory of Economic Development, he defined innovation as new goods which do not exist in the market, a new production method, a new market or raw material source, a new field of business, a new financial method, or a new way of organizing yourself. Now, how do we put that into the productivity equation? I think that is the grease or the oil that greases the machinery. And this is also what we call the virtual cycle of productivity. And I just put a very, very simple infographic up there, that productivity and good working condition, they go hand in hand. And the logic, as Claire said, if companies and ultimately countries can increase overall productivity levels, then this leads to higher wages and disposable incomes for workers, which stimulates demand for products and services and increase household spending, which means firms produce more because there are more demand for their products and services. Ideally, they can create more jobs. It leads to higher government revenue, means government can increase their fiscal space to invest further in the economy, infrastructure, housing, you name it, which again leads to overall increase in productivity or total factor productivity. So increased competitiveness, economic growth, and job growth, product innovation, and so on and so on. It all goes hand in hand. And I think the ILO's own experience, and now I'm going to my last slide before I hand over to Nimoy, is that we have actually made quite a contribution to this growing consensus. And we've heard about the importance of supporting especially SMEs, because we have a very, a long tail of lacking SMEs that don't have the same productivity levels as medium-sized and large enterprises. So getting SMEs closer to average productivity levels of large enterprise can have a huge development impact. And the ILO, our own program called Sustaining Competitive and Responsible Enterprise, we've implemented this in more than 13 countries, also in South Africa, in China, in some of the other countries, have actually demonstrated that improved workplace cooperation, we heard the Deputy Minister said a happy worker is a good worker, but improved workplace cooperation, quality management, clean production and resource efficiency, better human resource management, and occupational health and safety all increase productivity at firm level. The evidence is clear. It's out there. You see it also in the more developed economies. So better management also helps to lower accidents at work, because safe and healthy workplaces where production does not need to stop because of an accident, or it's actually more productive, right? You don't need to hold. So so this long term of unproductive firms, we need to bring them into the accurate productivity levels. And we see in the BRICS countries, if you look at the IMD World Competitive Yearbook that was mentioned earlier, that Brazil ranks 59, China is performing well at 17, India is 37, Russia is 45, that is the 2021 figures, and South Africa is 58. So there's great room for improvement compared to some of the more advanced and developed economies. So this is my last slide, and I just want you to look at this slide and remember that holistic infographic that Claire showed, where we look at micro level, we look at macro level, and we look at micro, meso, and macro level. So there are internal reasons and factors that influence productivity at the firm level, but there are also external factors in the system. And here, what you see up here, the first sort of line of words I'm putting up here, I'm not going to read everything for you, saying that all these things are internal to an enterprise. How can you motivate staff more? How can you have better management practices? How can you have effective workplace collaboration? Then at the meso level, we are looking at how well do you interact with institutions, labor market institutions, do you have access to finance, do you have access to services, and so on and so forth. Do you have access to social dialogue, institutions, if your business is organized, or both at the enterprise level, but also at worker level. And then finally, we look at the macro level, where we're looking at intellectual property right, we look at, is there red tape, is there a conducive investment environment, do you have an enabling environment to stable enterprise, and so on and so forth. And let me that be the handover to you, Nimoy, because now you can come and tell us what we are then doing in South Africa to try to address all these challenges.